Welcome everybody to the first of the Belief in the Northeast lectures of this year. A lot of you will be here through having been signed up to the Belief in the Northeast mailing list. Belief in the Northeast is a community archaeology project which is being run through Durham Department of Archaeology at Durham University, where I am based. I'm a member of the academic staff there, and it's being funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. We launched the project originally about 18 months ago, but as you may have noticed, there's been a bit of a bug going around recently. So having successfully launched our project and started doing some field work and started doing some events, we rapidly ground to a halt probably about 11 months ago for obvious reasons. That's obviously put the kibosh on any attempt of doing field work for the short term, and obviously due to the added pressure of work and things for myself and the department, we didn't really have a hiatus. But this year we have started to restart the project. Inevitably, some of the first activities are going to be online rather than in real life, but fingers crossed with the following wind, hopefully by the summer, we will be in a position to actually start developing and carrying out some of those fieldwork projects which we'd actually planned. And if you don't know much about the Belief in the Northeast project and come to this through other means, do have a look at our website. It gives you an idea of what we're all about, and the website's down there, www.beliefne.net. In practical terms tonight, I know a lot of us have been spending all our waking hours on Zoom, but just for those of you who've luckily escaped that joy, in practical terms, over today's sessions, make sure you're mute, so we don't hear mobile phones and children and pets and such like interrupting my sparkling prose. If you've got questions, the best thing to do in these situations, you've got quite a lot of people, is to put the question in the chat bar. And if you poke around, you should be able to find the chat bar. And after I've given my talk, I'll kind of go through them in order. We've got a lot of people here, so it's going to be easier doing that rather than people kind of raising hands and such like. In practical terms, as I said, I am recording this, so it can be we can put it onto YouTube later on. But as I said, I will be editing out all the pre-chat, so don't worry about anything on that front. But just to be aware that, you know, if you're asking a question or anything like that, that will be broadcast. So if you're suddenly feeling very anxious about your new haircut or anything like that, you might want to turn your camera off. It's entirely up to you. So I think with no more ado, we'll start talking about this lecture series. So we're starting off with a series of 5 lectures mainly in February, and the initial selection of lectures is a grab sample, as we call it in archaeology, of a range of different topics, but all related to broadly thinking about how archaeologists and archaeology can help us think about looking at religion, particularly thinking about homing in on northern and northeast England. Some of the issues will range more widely. So hopefully you're all expecting to hear me talk in a minute about the archaeology on the Holy Island of Lindisfarne, which some of you may know about, some of you will be perhaps learning about for the first time. Next week we've got Dr. Freya Horsfield. When I put the initial marketing out about this, it was coming from Freya Horsfield, but since I put the initial adverts out, Freya has passed her PhD, so she's now Dr. Freya Horsfield, and she'll be talking about her work on medieval monasticism in northern England, which she recently said she completed her PhD with us in the Department of Archaeology at Durham. Then February the 10th, we've got Professor Sarah Semple, who is a leading expert on Anglo-Saxon religion, particularly kind of pre-Christian religion in the Anglo-Saxon world. Then we have following 2 lectures are with 2 of our PhD students. So you've got Anthony Lee, who's talking about not so much Roman religion itself, but how it's displayed in museums and the kind of decisions we have to make when we're trying to explain about religious systems, which are very, very different to the religious systems we might be used to today. So he'll be talking about that. And then finally, we'll be finishing off ending with the early medieval world, as we start with the early medieval world, with a lecture from Christina Smith, who is working, doing a PhD with me on Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture in Northumbria in the greatest sense. So, as I said, before we go, make sure you have muted your mics once you started the lecture, particularly if you plan to fall asleep and start snoring halfway through. Otherwise, questions to go into the chat bar. And with that, no more ado, I think we can start. So, what I want to talk today, someone's got their mic on, so everyone just double check that they've got their mics off. What I want to talk today is about archaeological work which I've been involved with my collaborators Dig Ventures on the holy island of Lindisfarne. We've been running the project now for 5 years, and I'm going to talk about some of the headline results from our explorations, talk a little bit about the island, a little bit about some of the things we're finding out, and some of the things we want to find out in the future. So I'm going to work on a principle that most of you know where Lindisfarne is. I imagine a lot of you will probably have been there. It's a small island on the northeast coast of Northumberland. It's a tidal island, and we know it's a tidal island as far back as the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, the island has its importance, obviously, as a centre for early medieval Christianity. And in this one slide, I'm going to give you all the historical dates you're going to need. I'm an archaeologist, so I don't deal with historical dates. I deal with archaeological dates, which are much more vague. Essentially, Lindisfarne is founded in AD 635 by King Oswald and Aidan. Oswald has just become the new king of Northumbria. He has been, before that, he has been in exile in Western Scotland, because if you are an heir to an Anglo-Saxon throne, it is very bad for your health because people want to stop you being the heir to the Anglo-Saxon throne. So he was in exile with his family in Western Scotland, waiting for his opportunity to swoop in and seize power. He probably converts to Christianity on Iona, or the great Irish monastery off the west coast of Mull in Western Scotland. When he comes back to Northumbria, he brings this monk Aidan with him, and he establishes a monastery on Lindisfarne. And given the fact that Iona is a small island and Lindisfarne is a small island, it's hard to resist the idea that he's essentially trying to establish his own Iona on the eastern side of Britain, his own Northumbrian Iona. Now, one of the problems is he's converted to the Irish tradition of Christianity, whereas the Christians already in Anglo-Saxon Northumbria at this period were following a slightly different tradition, more influenced directly by Rome and the Frankish kingdoms and Kent, which wasn't a big problem at first because they were all part of the same church, but there were differences, particularly in things like how the dates of Easter were calculated, and other kind of quite technical issues. But one of the things which would have been obviously different is monks had different haircuts. There's different ways in which monks were tonsured according to which tradition you were following. This initially was a minor issue. It became increasingly important over the next 30 years on a kind of domestic level, in the sense that by the time we get to 664, Oswy, who by this time is Northumbrian king, he is following the Irish tradition, and he starts his feast after Easter, while his wife, who's following the other tradition, is still fasting. So that's not a recipe for domestic harmony. But more than that, it's a socio and cultural and political issue about which way Northumbria wanted to face, metaphorically and politically. Did Northumbria want to see itself as part of the northern world, of the world of the Picts, the world of the Scots, the world of the Strathclyde British, or was it turning to face towards the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and to the continental mainland? And in 664, at the Synod of Whitby, Oswy makes the decision that the Northumbrian Church is going to fall into conformity with the rest of the Anglo-Saxon Church and mainstream European Christianity. And that's a key turning point, because the monks of Lindisfarne spoke very strongly for the Irish tradition at the Synod of Whitby, and when they lost, their abbot Tolman went back to Lindisfarne, and the monks who didn't want to conform to the new tradition, they all left. They went to Iona first, and then to Western Ireland, where a couple of monasteries were established. It's around this point, and about 20 years later, that Cuthbert comes onto the scene. Cuthbert is a monk from the Scottish borders, who is completely locked into the Roman, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon tradition. He is kind of ideologically clean pair of hands, and this is really important because what every Northumbrian monastery needs, well, not every Northumbrian, what every early medieval monastery needs is a patron saint. Now, normally that would be the founding figure, but the problem with Lindisfarne is the founding figure Aidan was associated with the Irish Church. So Cuthbert comes in, and it's a kind of new, it's a rebranding in many ways. He spends time as the abbot. He spends time his final days as a hermit out on the inner Farne Island, and then he does the best possible thing he could do for the monks of Lindisfarne. Is he dies because you can't have a saint unless he's dead. So Cuthbert dies. He's brought back to Lindisfarne from inner Farne, where he is buried, and after 10 years his body is exhumed, and as always seems to happen in these situations, his body is found to be miraculously preserved, and this is the proof that is accepted as the fact that he is a saint. And there's a series of miracles associated with this. And the next step to making a saint, there's very little paperwork involved in making an Anglo-Saxon saint. They literally take his body out of the ground and they raise it in a shrine above the ground. And that is the de facto way in which a saint was made. And this is the point where we see the development of the cult of Cuthbert, because he acts as a centre for pilgrimage. Pilgrims bring money, they bring other resources, they give land to the church. And it's around this time that the Lindisfarne Gospels are probably created as part of this kind of program of promotion of Cuthbert. And Lindisfarne rapidly becomes really, really important. It's given huge blocks of land in northern Northumberland, southern Scotland, and also down in County Durham. So everything's going swimmingly for about 100 years. The monastery is looked after by kings. One of the kings, Anglo-Saxon kings, even retires to Lindisfarne. But then in 793, we have the first Viking attack on Lindisfarne, which this is the famous Viking attack everybody knows about. But actually, what a lot of people don't really appreciate is that first Viking attack was kind of a one-off. It was a surprise, and it's not until the mid-9th century that the tempo of Viking attacks on Lindisfarne really start to increase. And then the traditional story is, and we'll look at that a little bit later, but the traditional story is that that's the point in the 9th century that the monks leave Lindisfarne, taking Cuthbert's relics and other saints' relics, and indeed one of the wooden churches they dismantle, they take them, they leave the island, they go inland, they go to Durham up on the Tweed, they go over to Western Scotland very briefly, they go down to Crake in Yorkshire, they end up in Chester Street, and finally in AD 995 they land in Durham, and they found what becomes the religious establishment that becomes Durham Cathedral. And then finally, after the Norman conquest, some of the monks from what's now Durham, the monastery at Durham, go back to Lindisfarne and refound the monastery there. So when you go and visit the island today, those are the ruins you see. So just a reminder of where we are. We're up on the northeast corner of England. Really important thing to remember, that Anglo-Scottish border is completely irrelevant in the period I'm talking about. The Anglo-Scottish border doesn't really crystallise till the really to the 11th century. So at this point, the Kingdom of Northumbria extends up to the Firth of Forth, extends westwards into Dumfries and Galloway over to the Irish Sea. So rather than thinking of Northumbria as a northern English kingdom, it's better to think of it as a central British kingdom. It holds that big block of land in the middle of Britain. To the north are the Picts and the Strathclyde British and the Irish-speaking kingdom of Dalriata, and down to the south you've got the big Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So it's a tidal island. Talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the village, I imagine a lot of you will have been to, sits in that southwest corner of the island. And you can see here on this diagram, that's where our trench excavations are. So it's important to remember that the island has changed in some ways since the Anglo-Saxon period. We know that it was tidal back then because Bede writes very clearly about its tidal nature, but in other ways there clearly have been some changes. The sea level hasn't changed that much, but we'll come in a minute and talk about some changes to the coastline. What we do know is that today, if you want to go onto the island, you come along a causeway from Beal, and that brings you along the western tail, and you skirt along the southern edge of the island all the way around to the village. But we don't have to go back very far to find maps which clearly show that there were causeways which ran straight from the village to the mainland. So you can see here, this is a 1769 map, which shows a causeway. I've highlighted them in red, running basically, it's an extension of Marygate, the main drag on the island, running straight across to Fenham. And that makes absolute sense because Fenham was the centre of all the estates of a block of land called Islandshire on the mainland. And it's where the monks had their tithe barn in a later period. And it seems this is probably the original main access route to the mainland. But we see there are other causeways as well. Another thing that's changed are the sand dunes. Many of you will know the Northumbrian coast, and you'll know that the sand dunes give it character, and they're a really important part of that landscape. Those sand dunes mainly date to the later medieval and early post-medieval period. They're a product of increasingly stormy weather in the North Sea. And we see that very clearly. We can see that on Lindisfarne, where actually some of the sand dunes cover earlier medieval field systems. They're clearly on top. And those of you who know Bamborough, the sand dunes down there covered an Anglo-Saxon cemetery. So we know that the sand dunes are later. The final big difference we have is in and around the harbour itself. Nowadays, if you visit the harbour, we've got this beautiful curved semicircular harbour. But you can see from the aerial photograph on the right, but actually behind it, there's this big kind of wet, lush area of grassland. And those of you who've been to the island will know that's a very flat area. And essentially, until the late 18th century, that area was a large open lagoon behind the shingle spit that formed the harbour. And you can see a map from the 17th century on the bottom right, which shows that really clearly. You can see there's this big area of open water behind. And that's really important because it meant that the village where the Anglo-Saxon monastery was located was much more clearly lined round by water. It's much more of a clear headland. It's only in the late 18th century, but though that area of a lagoon was drained to become grazing land, and that's how it's used today. So obviously with an Anglo-Saxon church or any monastery, it's the church that is the heart of the monastery. If you visit the island today, you will see two big churches in the centre of the village. You see the ruined church of the Priory, which is a nice Norman Romanesque style church. It's ruined, but if you look at the architecture, it's a little bit like a small Durham cathedral because it's founded by the monks from Lindisfarne, from Durham. And then adjacent to that is the parish church, and you can see that on the big plan here. You've got in black outline the Priory church, and then the parish church just down there to the bottom of the picture. And you can see that it's not perfect, but they're more or less aligned on each other. And that's quite interesting because if we're trying to find out where the Anglo-Saxon churches were on the monastery, on the island, seeing that alignment immediately raises questions, because we're seeing rows of churches like that is a really common feature in Anglo-Saxon monasteries in the south of England, Anglo-Saxon monasteries on the continent. So that's immediately a smoking gun that these later churches probably have earlier Anglo-Saxon predecessors. Certainly when the big Priory church was cleared out, the rubble was cleared out from it in the late 19th century, it wasn't proper archaeology, but there were traces of an earlier stone church, possibly earlier stone church, found underneath. Frustratingly, it's very, very poorly recorded. Also, people have got their microphones on, so can you just double check you haven't got your mic on? With the medieval parish church, which is still used as the parish church in the village today, there are hints of Anglo-Saxon fabric surviving, Anglo-Saxon masonry surviving within the later medieval church. So that's certainly a hint that that's where the core of the Anglo-Saxon monastery is, and the fact that a lot of the Anglo-Saxon sculpture which comes from the island has been found in the churchyard and associated with the church, again, is another smoking gun. Because one of the surprising things about Lindisfarne is really how little archaeology had been done on the island until the last decade.
Yeah, what about on the Hoof, mate?
Well, we're about to talk about that. So what we have is a monastery where we know we've got hints where it is around the village, but we have very little archaeological work which had been done really since maybe 2010. It's really odd because someone like Iona has been cut to ribbons by archaeologists, to be brutal. Mark Weymouth and Jarrow have seen lots of archaeological work, but for all sorts of reasons, Lindisfarne had never really been explored. There have been little bits of work. There's a really interesting early medieval site on the north of the island. There had been work done on by Brian Hope Taylor, who was a famous archaeologist who excavated the Anglo-Saxon site at Yevering. He spent a desultory season's excavation in 1962 on Lindisfarne, but never published his results particularly. So it's only in the last decade that archaeology on Lindisfarne's really seen a revival, which has been absolutely wonderful. I'll talk about our excavations in a minute, but first of all, I want to mention the work which has been done by the archaeological practice as part of the Peregrini HLF.
Absolutely.
Someone's still got their mic on, so can you just double check everyone's got their mics off. So we have this wonderful piece of archaeology done by the archaeological practice. This is part of a much wider community heritage project on the island. They excavated up on the Hoof. So the Hoof is this rocky crag which overlooks the village. It's a very obvious landmark when you arrive at the village, and it dominates the village, and also it provides excellent observation point looking southwards towards Bamborough and over across to the inner Farne Island. There's always been known there's earthworks on the Hoof. Brian Hope Taylor came and surveyed archaeological remains there. He did some excavation on a rectangular structure, and you can see on the photograph here that rectangular structure has been revealed there. But when Hope Taylor excavated it, he just didn't quite go down far enough, and he was convinced it was basically a stone rubble building, which he thought might have been a church, but didn't really prove it. And then the team from the archaeological practice did a lovely bit of work and opened up a trench over these earlier ruins more recently, and lo and behold, came up with this feature. It's a rectangular stone structure. It's got the classic church plan. It has a larger open area and a smaller chamber at one end. There's frustratingly little dating evidence for it, but I think on grounds of probability, it sits most firmly within probably a later Anglo-Saxon context. And again, it's a frustrating structure for me. It's almost certainly a church. But we don't have any absolute diagnostic church features. There are some things which it's a little bit unusual, but it's very hard to think what else it could be apart from a church. But hopefully it's a site which we know it's there, and archaeologists have to think about best ways of how something like this can be dated. Because one of the frustrating things about archaeology on Lindisfarne more generally is the lack of clear dating evidence for the early medieval period. There's a whole series of other features excavated along the Hoof, and Paul, who's here, was involved with that. Big stone platform features further west along the Hoof, rock-cut graves in what was the Chapel of the Lights, with again seemingly late Anglo-Saxon carbon-14 dates. It's a wonderful piece of work. I'm not going to talk much more about that because it wasn't my project, and yeah, it's important to acknowledge that work was driven by by the archaeological practice who've done a really good bit of work excavating and understanding all those features along the Hewf. But what was clear is that feature was the crag was heavily utilised in the early medieval and medieval periods, and there's lots of things there, and there's still a lot of things up there which need further investigation. But I got involved with Lindisfarne originally through my teaching at university. I used to take students up there. I'm a specialist in early medieval Christianity. And I used to take students up there and think, oh, this is an amazing site. Why doesn't somebody do some archaeological fieldwork on it? And it took me about 10 years to realise that I could do the archaeological fieldwork. It was a kind of slow process. I had another big project on the go, and it wasn't really until about 7 or 8 years ago I was in a situation to start thinking about Lindisfarne a bit more seriously. Now, as always with archaeology, we don't just dig a trench randomly hoping that we're going to find something. We do kind of due diligence beforehand. We do what we call evaluation work. So that's what we did on Lindisfarne. We did a geophysical survey across all the green areas around the village that we could easily get access to, and we found all sorts of features. And you can see here there's lots of things. The geophysical surveys are these grey fuzzy areas around the village core, and you can immediately see there's lots of things there. But my personal interests were in looking for the earlier monastery rather than the later monastery. Now immediately you can see there's some things down here just to the south of that little red square. There's the distinctive plan of a second cloister to the monastery. Unusually, Lindisfarne seems to have the Holy Island Priory seems to have had 2 cloisters, but that's of a Norman or later date. There's also lots and lots of other things going on. It's not always easy to pick out. Some of the things are later. There's a big power cable going through one of the fields, which is very important for us to know where not to dig. You don't want to put a trench through a power cable. But one of the things I was interested in was could we find a boundary for the monastery? One would expect an early medieval monastery to have a ditch or a bank around it. And one thing which popped out is if you look here on the left-hand side where the blue trenches, you can see there's a kind of boundary which runs through, it's picked up by the roads and runs around there. So we've put this little blue trench, is a little trench we put in just to test that boundary. I was hoping we'd find a great big early medieval ditch. Instead, what we found was a lovely later medieval path or road with lots of later medieval buildings on it. And it came very clear through our work and the geophysics that originally the medieval village went right the way up to that western shoreline. We did find a fragment of earlier medieval comb, but we realised there that if you wanted to get down to early medieval layers, it would mean going through a lot of later medieval material. So we purely pragmatically decided to leave that one alone. Instead, we focused on the field to the east, which is known as Sanctuary Close, and we initially did 2 little evaluation trenches before focusing our excavations once we realised that's the area we wanted to look at. So our initial evaluation trench in that eastern field, one of the first things we found was human bone, which is terribly exciting. It wasn't, we weren't initially human graves. It was a mixed jumble of human bones, what we call charnel. It was clearly out of context. And it was pretty clear that that field had probably been ploughed in the medieval period. And we think that the top layers of the burials have been churned up by that ploughing. But certainly human bone, but what date was it? It could have been part of the later medieval monastery. It could even have been unknown Quaker burial ground. There could have been shipwrecked sailors. There could have been all sorts of things. So we did some carbon-14 dating, and that showed us that we were broadly actually in the early medieval period, which was absolutely fantastic. We also found 1 or 2 other interesting little bits of carved stone, which I'll show you in a minute, which were also of Anglo-Saxon date. So we realised that this is the place we wanted to be. So we expanded our small trench into a much bigger trench. That was actually 2 bigger trenches. But as I said, there's a big power cable going straight through our excavation area. And if we put our digger through that, we'd have turned the navigation lights off on the Hewf and things would have sunk. So we decided not to do that. So we've really got a western trench and an eastern trench. And here is a photo of our eastern trench. And you can see, what have we got? Well, immediately you can see there's human burials there, and what a lot of human burials we're getting. You can see the obvious human burials in the middle of the picture. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but also lots, all these little round things are all these are skulls. There are human remains absolutely everywhere. Huge number of intercutting graves. We're not excavating all of them. We're being quite strategic about what we excavate, but we're certainly finding a series of really well preserved Anglo-Saxon graves, and this gives you a sense of what they look like. The preservation's lovely, which is really rare for Northumbria, where generally the acid soils mean we don't get great bone preservation. But here you get a sense of the kind of human remains we're finding. The bodies are aligned west-east, head to the west. There's virtually no grave goods. There's no signs of coffins. These bodies seem to be buried in shrouds. The bodies are often quite hunched up. Also, we found quartz pebbles, which I'll come and talk about in a minute. But you can see the kind of thing. They're all quite similar. Don't say huge amount of diversity, but the great thing is that preservation means we're going to be able to really analyze these things in an awful lot of detail. So what do we know about our people in our graves? Well, the first thing is we know demographically in terms of the who they represent. We've got men, which one would expect on a monastery. We've got women, bit less likely in a male monastery. We've got children. Now, people like Bede became a monk at the age of 7, so maybe just about they could be monks. But then we've got babies. We've got I think we've got two women and children, but women buried with very young babies. So I think it's clear what we've got is not the monastic burial ground. It's a burial ground either of the island population or pilgrims and people coming to visit the monastery. And Bede actually writes, when he describes the monastery, he talks about there being a cemetery of the brothers. So he makes it clear there's a separate monastic cemetery. And from what we know of other monastic sites, that's precisely what we'd expect to find: multiple different cemeteries scattered across the larger area. Now, we do have some interesting burial traditions. A number of them are found with either quartz pebbles. We've got one, I think one's in their hand, but just beautiful round, opaque, crystalline quartz pebbles. We've got thousands of them from across this area. Now, these aren't things you find naturally on the island. We've tried all the beaches, and you can maybe find one. If you spend 3 or 4 people looking for half an hour, you might find one. And we have thousands of these things. They're clearly deliberately being brought from elsewhere and put in these graves. And this is a tradition which is found more widely across early Christian graves in northern England, in Scotland and Ireland. It has the tradition of quartz pebbles and burials goes back into pre-history as well. We've also got some graves lined with stone linings, but as I said, most of them are very, very simple, just cut into the ground. But what's interesting is a lot of these graves are intercutting. So as they're cutting into each other, they're disturbing each other. They cut into a grave, they'll get the bones from the leg bones from the grave they've disturbed and throw them back in with the person who's being buried there. It's an absolute pickle, frankly. There's just human remains absolutely everywhere. So it's a very, very painstaking job to get these things excavated. But there's a huge amount we can do with this kind of material. Obviously, we can do the traditional analysis. We can see how old they are, get a sense about, are they male, are they female. We can look for things like injuries. One of our skulls we excavated this year had a massive either axe or sword cut in the back of the skull. Very, very nasty injury. But we can look at things like diseases. We know that some of them have metabolic diseases, some of them were malnourished. But nowadays, using modern technology, we can look at the chemical composition of the bones themselves, some of the isotopic variations of the bones, and that can give us information on diet, so how much meat, how much dairy, how much vegetable matter, how much maritime resources they're eating. We can even, hopefully, further on down the line, do analysis and start getting a sense of where they came from. Can we tell whether are these local people, are these people coming from elsewhere in Britain or even from the continent? So we're in early days of doing this analysis, but there's something that's really exciting potential. And at Durham, we also have ancient DNA labs. So we're in the early days of exploring the potential of extracting DNA from some of these burials as well, which could really tell us a lot about the populations we're exploring. But as I said, we also had some of these coming up. These are fragments of Anglo-Saxon sculpture. These are so-called name stones. They're quite small. You can see from my colleague in the bottom left there holding a tiny fragment of one. They're all quite fragmented, and these are essentially little burial markers. They probably would have stood at the head of the graves. They're much smaller than modern gravestones. They're about the size of between an A4 file pad and a good size paperback novel. That's a slightly unorthodox way of saying how big things are. You can see these ones are very fragmented, and I think that's because of the ploughing. But here is a picture of some of the other ones which have been found on the island, and you get a sense of what they look like. They have crosses on. Some of the ones, such as you can see in the middle here, they've got sunken areas on the terminals where there's probably a metal or glass inset set within them. They carry fragments of names. So if we go back to our ones, here we've got the name, and you have to take my word for this, Utfrith, previously unrecorded Anglo-Saxon name. That's Utfrith. We've got here we've got Wolf. So at the end of a name like, well, that is our name element Wolf, like you get in Beowulf. This is not Beowulf's grave, but that Wolf element's often found in Anglo-Saxon names. So these are great because these date to the 8th and 9th centuries. Again, they tell us, they complement the carbon-14 dates we're getting, confirming that our cemetery sits in precisely the period when we know the monastery was there. But these things probably would have been painted originally as well. And what's interesting, those of you who are familiar with things like the Lindisfarne Gospel and some of those early medieval illuminated manuscripts, these actually look very like the decorated carpet pages you find in some of these gospel books, and they're clearly part of that same artistic output. These are being probably put here at the same time as the Lindisfarne Gospel is being created, or being created by people who would have been intimately familiar with the work on the Lindisfarne Gospel. This is our most exciting find sculpturally, as far as I'm concerned. Admittedly, I'm a bit geeky about these things. Now, this isn't as fancy as our namestones, but you can see we've got we've got a central stem, 2 parallel lines, and 2 crosses, and a cross on either side. Now, this is what we found in our first season, and it was immediately a bit odd because to my knowledge, it doesn't really compare with any other Anglo-Saxon sculpture we found in County Durham or Northumberland. The nearest parallels we could find were from places like Whithorn in Dumfries and Galloway, or some of the crosses from places like Argyll, or even in Ireland. And what we guessed was that this was actually the central element was probably a bigger cross, and there's 2 crosses either side. Now, this doesn't often happen, but 2 years later, we found the top bit. There you can see on the left, about 3 or 4 meters from where we found the first bit. They joined together. The only reason why they're different colors is because the bottom will have been cleaned by that point. But you can see it's really similar to this stone, the so-called Golgotha stone from Whithorn. Now, Whithorn is a big Northumbrian monastery down in Dumfries and Galloway, we know was part of the Anglo-Saxon church. So it's really nice at Lindisfarne to find a piece of sculpture which kind of alludes or makes references to that Northumbrian church over in the west of Scotland. So although it doesn't look very impressive, it's a really important piece of sculpture. Now, this is our western trench. This is the other side of our cemetery trench. That's what I used to say, but one of the things which we've been finding the last 2 seasons is, as you can probably see, we're starting to get more and more human burial over here. And it's clear that our cemetery is both quite extensive, and certainly we're getting graves all over the western half of our burial area. And again, we've had some more fragments of Anglo-Saxon namestones coming out of this area. But the interesting stuff is really going on over here. We've got in the northeast corner, so the northwest, what's the northwest corner of a trench, but the top right of the picture, we've got a series of stone piles, and again, you'll have to take my word for it, but we've got at least one structure. So you've got a line of stones running along here, and then there's actually a little gully which turns up this way. So a very crude stone structure. And then this is not a photo taken when it had been fully excavated. We started to excavate a very, very big feature, which is, we've got some of it excavated here, but it keeps on running around. It cuts this feature here, runs around there, and this entire area in the middle seems to be related to early medieval metalworking, and I'll talk more about that in a second. That's the that's an earlier plan of our little building. As you can say, it's quite scrappy, and these stone bases wouldn't have been for stone walls. They would have been what's called post pads on which you put a wooden superstructure. So they're simply to try and keep it dry. And this really scrappy photo is from Hartlepool, and it shows a very similar kind of building. And Hartlepool was the site of another monastery, also founded by Aidan and Oswald, and a really good parallel with Lindisfarne. And actually back then, Hartlepool Headland was actually a tidal island, so that the two sites are very similar. So we've got our building, but increasingly it became clear that we had this bigger feature popping up underneath it, and it's a large metalworking area. We're still working on the analysis of the debris from our features so far. It's got a real mix of metalworking evidence. So we've got their metalwork, they're doing ironwork. So some of the slag is stuff which might be the slag you find from a blacksmith, someone doing basic metalworking, horseshoes, kind of simple metal tools. We have got hints they might have been iron smelting as well. So that's heating the ore to get the iron from the iron ore, which is a bit more unusual, and we're still doing some analysis on this material. We've also got evidence for non-ferrous metalworking. So we've got a copper alloy ingot, we've got fragments and spills and drops of what seems to be spilt blobs of molten copper alloy. So as well as doing blacksmithing, they're also casting copper alloy objects. And then we've got all sorts of other bits and pieces we're still exploring. You've got furnace lining and what could be a crucible, and some other odd slags which we're not quite sure what they are yet. And rather pleasingly, on the left here you see a picture from the Franks casket, which is an 8th century whalebone casket, probably made in Northumbria almost exactly the same time as our metalworking area was in action, and it actually shows Wayland the smith, the mythic kind of semi-mythic figure of Anglo-Saxon mythology. But you can see him there with his metalworking tongs and his crucibles and his other equipment. There is a big hammer up there, and that's exactly what would have been happening at our site. And rather pleasingly, the best parallel we have is from just over the water at Bamborough, where they have a very similar area of metalworking. So it's nice that we've got a metalworking area from a monastery and from an Anglo-Saxon royal centre. So that's going to be a really fruitful area. We can explore that more in detail. There's lots to unpick there. We're also getting lots of animal bones from the site, which again is really pleasing, because generally animal bone doesn't survive well in the north. What animals are we getting? Well, we're getting the obvious stuff. We're getting horse, we're getting cattle, we're getting deer, pig, sheep and goats, not easy to distinguish. We've got dog, I think we've got a little bit of cat now, I'd have to check that. We've got hare and rabbit. Some of this stuff clearly dates to the later medieval period. So this list includes things we found in our little western trench over the other side of the island, which is later medieval. We're getting lots of birds as well. So not surprisingly, you've got geese, you've got chicken, you've got the pheasant. That's obviously much later, but we're getting puffin and gull and guillemot. So they're clearly exploiting those maritime resources. Obviously in Northumbria, people nowadays, or people in the medieval period, don't seem to have eaten a lot of these things, but even until relatively recently in Western Isles of Scotland and the Northern Isles, things like puffins were eaten quite regularly. I'd hate to think what puffin tasted like. I'm not ever going to plan to do that, but they were clearly an important resource. There's no puffins on Lindisfarne now, so we don't know whether they were living on the island at the time, or whether it means that they're going over to the Farne Islands to harvest the puffins, which I imagine wouldn't be very hard because they're not the brightest of birds. But it's not just seagulls and seabirds we're getting when it comes to the maritime world. We're also getting lots of evidence for fish and seafood itself. So we've got here's a list of the fish we get. We've got cod, we've got ling, eel, haddock, shark, ray. Some of these cod are quite big, so they're probably going out quite far into the North Sea. Some of these fish are more shallow water fish, but some of them are clearly going out, drawn from much deeper waters, which is quite important, because it shows that the monks are exploiting the coastal, the maritime resources on their doorstep. They're also eating oysters and periwinkles and whelks and a range of other shellfish. And of course, Bede, in the Ecclesiastical History, his great work of history, he writes at the very beginning, when he's just setting the scene to the landscape of Britain, he talks about those maritime resources of Britain, and he says, Britain, an island in the Atlantic, has the greatest plenty of salmon and eels and seals and dolphins and whales. So as far as Bede is concerned, and he's a Northumbrian monk, the sea is an important resource. And following Bede's words, not surprisingly, we've also started to find seal bone on the island as well from early medieval contexts. Now, seal are obviously again, not part of our modern diet, though they were eaten in Northumbria into the post-medieval period. But they're basically great big grumpy sacks of calories. They're great big blubbery things. They're not that hard to catch. Very full of energy. But we suspect that also their blubber was used for lamp oil. Their hide, we know from documentary sources, were used for making things like ships' ropes and even sails. And the Anglo-Saxon voyage of Othere, which talks about an Anglo-Saxon merchant or Anglo-Saxon contacts with the west coast of Norway and northern Norway at the time of King Alfred, he talks about using whale hide and seal hide to make ships' ropes. It's probable that the monastery were exploiting these seal herds quite extensively. From the life of St. Columba, who's the founding saint of Iona, this is a saint's life written about 100 years after Columba died, but it tells the story of how the monks got fed up with somebody stealing what they saw as their seal. So clearly monks or monasteries had a kind of proprietorial sense of looking after what they thought were their seal colonies. And obviously anyone who's been on the island today will know there's seal everywhere. You see them in the waters, you hear them moaning and groaning at night time too, and they're all out there on the Farne Islands as well. Also, it's not just seals. This a fragment of this is squamous bone, so that is a kind of rear part of the back end of a jawbone, and this is from a whale. We think it's probably a killer whale. We can't get to the reference collections at the moment to double check, but we think it's a killer whale, and you can see there's cut marks on it. And we know that the Anglo-Saxons were exploiting whale because, as I said, the Franks casket was made from whale bone, and there's other objects made from whale. And this lovely little quote is from an inscription on the Franks casket. It's really important because it talks about that the whale that the Franks casket was made out of seems to have been a whale that beached itself. We've got no evidence that the Anglo-Saxons are particularly going out and hunting whale, but they're always happy to exploit the beached whales which came along their coastlines. And given that the waters back then would have been much more populous with whales and cetaceans than they are nowadays, it probably wasn't an uncommon situation to find whale beached on the coasts of Northumberland. Other objects are relatively rare. This is a period with no pottery, so we've got no ceramics, but we do find other little things like this. This is the beautiful glass gaming piece we found from a board game, similar if not the same as Nefertafel, the Viking board game. It's about 15 millimeters high, made out of very dark blue glass coloured with cobalt. It's actually just about blue on a good day if you see you've got it well lit, with little bobbles on top. So it's probably a king piece for this game of Tafel. And again, it's a reminder that that monasteries aren't all about being isolated and living very poor and difficult lives. The monks at Lindisfarne weren't badly off. An Anglo-Saxon king retires there, and when he does so, he gives the monks permission to drink wine. So clearly, you could live a royal retired life in a monastery. These weren't necessarily desperately austere places. And what's interesting is our piece is very like this piece, which is found at a Pictish hill fort in Dundurn near Perth. And again, you can see it's very similar. I hate to admit it, but the Dundurn piece is a bit nicer than our one. Obviously, we haven't found the full set of ours yet. But again, you can see they're very similar objects. And it's a reminder of this kind of shared elite lifestyle, because other parallels we've got are from examples from trading sites in the Netherlands, for example. So this kind of North Sea world of an elite sharing a similar taste in board games. So, a king of Northumbria could probably meet a monk from Frisia and share and understand the rules of the board game they're playing. And we know, as I said, that monks are often playing board games. As I said, it's not all about prayer and austerity. These are board gaming or gaming boards from early medieval contexts from Inchmarlock in Argyll and Port Mahomac up in the far north of Scotland. So board games are clearly a part of daily life at these sites. Other objects we found, we've got spindle whirl, just the one. We've got a dress pin, this simple dress pin with holding a cloak. And whilst they're not very exciting to look at, they're really well paralleled from other early medieval sites of this period. But finally, we're getting coinage, and this is, I think, something I'm getting increasingly interested in. Ignore the 3 new ones today. I haven't been out on site today, so I'm just reusing a slide. But we can see we're getting lots, well, not lots, we've got about 15 now Anglo-Saxon coins of 8th and early 9th century dates. So we've got what are called shatters and what are called stikers. And these are both kind of common Anglo-Saxon coins of this period. And that's quite important because we're well north of anything which could remotely be called a town at this period. And it's a reminder that the monasteries are probably the biggest population centres in this area, and they probably acted as the nearest we can imagine as trade centres or centres for exchange. Interestingly, all our coins have come quite close to our metalworking area. So I also wonder whether actually we're seeing some of the coins being molten down and as a source of both copper alloy or potentially small quantities of silver, where these coins generally had quite a low silver content. They're quite thoroughly debased. So that's where we are at the moment. We just ending. We had our 5th season. We were really lucky and got a field season in last year. We had about in a tiny window in September where we could get out and do some field work. So we're currently writing up our first 5 years at Excavation at the moment. Obviously, we've got lots of questions for the future. We're going to try and run the project for another 5 years. Kind of pandemic willing. So we want to understand the metalworking area. We've still got a lot of archaeology to do there. We've still got lots of excavation, lots of material to move. So we're hoping to find more metalworking evidence. Laboratory work, of course, is important. So analysing the dead, the bodies, which for everything they can tell us from their bones, and also increasingly trying to look beyond our excavation trenches. So we are in the early days of talking to the National Trust about looking around the castle site, where an Anglo-Saxon strap end was found a long time ago. So there could be early medieval activity over there. We'd like to try and look at St. Cuthbert's Island in some way. And we've got a PhD student working on reconstructing the landscape, the past landscape of the island as well, using a range of geoarchaeological techniques. So that brings me to the end. The usual range of thanks have to go to all the people on the island who make it absolutely possible. I haven't actually named the pub there, but the guys at Crown and Anchor are very, very important. And it's very important, if you ever run an excavation, make sure you can see your trenches from the pub garden. It's a very, very helpful way of being able to run a complicated field project. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to, if you've got questions, put them into the chat bar, and I'm going to go kind of through them and answer some of those questions. It's going to be easier to do that rather than kind of getting people to talk out loud. So let me just go back to the beginning. Right, so as for the age ranges from a question from Lauren, yeah, our burials date from the 8th century to the 11th century. One of the things we're really interested in at the moment is that ought to be, but the traditional story is that there's a gap where the monks leave the island and then come back. But there's, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that most of the sculpture on the island dates to when that gap actually is in place, we're thinking that probably the monastery continued. Maybe the relics and the monastic core left. We think there's continued activity on the island. If we can get carbon-14 dates to show burials through that, that would help us with our argument. Are there any questions where, now, is there any indication where the quartz pebbles would have been brought from? Basically, no, we're not sure. Quartz pebbles are found on that coastline. So they're found further up as well. Once you get over into Scotland, kind of Coldingham, St Abbs, that area, they are found, but we're pretty sure we can't. It's possible that they actually just found all the quartz pebbles on Lindisfarne and they're all in our trench and none of them are on the beaches anymore. I find that quite hard to believe, but it does seem to be being brought from elsewhere. The trouble is, it's very difficult to geologically source quartz pebbles. It's not something we could easily do at this stage. How extensive are the textile remains? We don't actually have any textile remains per se at the moment. We do have the spindle whorl, which we're hoping to analyse a bit more. In this period, it's almost certain that the monks are exploiting sheep, particularly. It's really important to remember that it's not just the animals on the island. As I said, the monastery has massive estates on the mainland, and it's likely they had very large herds of cattle, both for eating and for parchment, of course, as well. And these are all things we're trying to analyse a bit more. Is it likely that these burials represent Christians? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's pretty clear that by the time you get into the 8th century, Northumbria is pretty much Christianized, and certainly anybody burying on Lindisfarne, almost by definition, because it's a monastery, is going to be Christian. It's possible, I mean, there are, in theory, a possibility that we could find a Viking grave or something like that when they excavated a cemetery of a similar date at Oldham, up towards Dunbar, North Berwick, that area in southeast Scotland. They actually found an early medieval Christian cemetery with a Viking burial plonked in the middle of it. So in theory, we could find an unlucky Viking, but he probably wouldn't have been buried by his colleagues. He would have been buried by one of the monks. So he would have been buried as a Christian. So puffin, still eaten in Iceland? Yes. I did try finding out whether I could buy puffin on the internet, because I wanted to do a session with my students on things people used to eat, and neither can you get salted gannet, which is the other guga, which is eaten in the Western Isles. There's still licenses to hunt the gannet, but it doesn't seem to be, sadly, you can't buy that commercially. Interestingly, with the seal bones, I did go down a wormhole, because one of the things that struck me is they're probably rendering the seal down. We've got no evidence for big cauldrons of the sort you could heat and boil big bits of seal up in. But I found that if you go onto YouTube, there's a whole world of Inuit and Alaskan indigenous native cooking videos in places like Baffin Island and Greenland as well. And it basically, if you put a chopped up seal in a pot, it will self-render. So if you just stick it in a wooden bucket, it will kind of self-render. If you're squeamish, don't look at the videos. I'm just warning you now. There's a fragment from whale from Jarrow. Absolutely, yeah. There's some fragments from a number of places actually. There's a lovely whale-blown fragment from Blythburgh down in Suffolk. There's just been a paper I haven't even read yet. I've printed it out on whale from early medieval London. So yeah, whale bone seems to be quite well exploited. They weren't going to look a gift whale in the mouth, as it were, when they beached themselves. So why did I say the monks allegedly left the island in 875? Well, that's because there was a series of histories of the community of St Cuthbert, the monks of St Cuthbert, written by a Norman writer called Simeon of Durham. He was writing when the community had been well established in Durham, and he was writing the kind of history of their community. And he writes that basically, he says in 875, everybody left. But as I said, one of the problems is most of the sculpture from the island, not the name stones, most of the other sculpture kind of dates from after 875. So if you're finding religious sculpture on the island, we need people who can design it, people who can create it, and people who want to commission it as well. And also there's been some recent PhD work on the historical sources who've actually brought up odd textual sources which haven't been really noticed before from elsewhere, referring to continued activity of various forms on the island. Is there any evidence for trading apart from possibly the coins? No, not yet. I mean, I'm still wildly optimistic that we might find, we could in theory find bits of imported pottery. We know that, say, down in York, there's pottery imported from northern Germany and Frisia and northern France. Now, very little of that gets north of Yorkshire, but Lindisfarne's just the kind of place where it might reach. And the same goes for things like Gaulish imported glassware, or even we know that grindstones, querns, were sometimes imported from the Rhineland as well. So Lindisfarne's precisely the kind of places we might find imported materials. The thing is, we've got a very small site, a very small trench, and Lindisfarne would have been a very big monastery. So it's really whether we're lucky and hit those kinds of bits of material. So just going down those questions, do we have any evidence of spiritual significance in pre-Christian times? No. Is that from you, Paul? Yes, it's from Paul. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Now, the name of the island by the name given to Lindisfarne by British writers, so people writing in what would have been essentially Old Welsh, but living in the north of England, they call it Ynys Medcaut, and Medcaut is arguably derived from doctor or medicine. So there's this kind of hint from the place name. It might have been seen as a healing centre before the establishment of the monastery, but that's all we've got. I find it very hard to believe it wasn't. I'm surprised there's no I mean, we've got odd little bits of prehistoric evidence. There's a lot of Mesolithic stuff from the north of the island. There's a Neolithic hand axe. There's a bit of Bronze Age metalwork. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, put it on the research list. You know, we're going to keep on pushing out the geophysical survey. So hopefully we might pick up. That's the kind of thing we might pick up. I can't believe there's not a Bronze Age round barrow or something there somewhere. It must have been. It's such an important part of the landscape around there. It must have been significant. So going down the questions, cattle bone, yeah, cattle bone and vellum. So vellum parchment, the stuff you write things like Lindisfarne Gospels on, is calf skin. Essentially, it's basically it's very thin, supple leather, and certainly they must have had access to lots and lots of calves. And the trouble is, it's not just calf skin; it has to be really good quality calf skin. It's not been bitten by insects or anything, so not every calf is going to produce parchment good enough for doing an illuminated manuscript on. There is a big set of animal bones from an early medieval site found on the north of the island, which is being analysed at the moment, which has been argued might have been producing for vellum production. It might be that we find tools related to vellum production as well, because they have a certain very distinctive kind of scrapers which are used. So that's certainly something we're keeping an eye out for. Now, evidence of Roman occupation. Yeah, there's some Roman occupation at Bamborough. Well, perhaps we caveat that. It's not Roman occupation, it's Roman objects. So we're well north of Hadrian's Wall here. So I don't think we need to see Bamborough as being a Roman settlement, but not surprisingly, those Iron Age tribes to the north are having kind of trade goods coming into the area north of the wall. And there's lots of arguments that the Iron Age tribes to the north of Hadrian's Wall were essentially client kingdoms forming a friendly buffer zone to the north of the wall, and the real problems with the Pride tribes further north. There is actually a fragment of amphora found, which is on display in the visitor centre, the English Heritage Visitor Centre on Lindisfarne. No one's quite sure where it came from, unfortunately. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if at some point we do find fragments of Roman pottery. So yeah, whether it's more likely to be an Iron Age settlement or a Roman Iron Age settlement with some Roman pottery. What's the significance of burying the head towards the west? By this point, by the time you get to the 8th to 9th century, this is the all-purpose Christian burial rite, which is found across Western Europe at this stage. There's lots of kind of arguments explaining bits to do with, say, when you are resurrected, you're facing Jerusalem, and that kind of thing. Though I think a lot of these explanations are kind of rationalizations of why it's west-east, because actually that west-east burial rite is something which Romans were using even before they were Christian, and it's just a kind of a perpetuation of a certain late Roman burial rite. So it's probably broadly to do with things like the sunrise and sunset in a very general sense, but I think it's hard to be more precise than that. Reusing graves and adding charnel from disturbed graves to new burials. Well, basically the trouble is they are cutting. There's so many burials in our area. Every time somebody stuck a grave through there, they would have cut through earlier graves. So it's important because it shows that those graves are quite long lived. We got at least one bit of articulated bone put in a second grave, which means it can't have been fully rotted when it was put back in the new grave which it had been cut from, which isn't a very nice thought. You find this, to be honest, whenever you get a graveyard where you get lots of graves intercutting, this happens because there's nowhere else to put the bone. And even if you walk through a graveyard around a medieval church today, if there's a molehill, you often find random bits of animal bone and random bits of human bone just kind of popping up. So it's an inevitable thing that happens when you have lots of graves which aren't well marked and people wanting to bury on top of them. So I don't think it's a particular Christian practice. I think it's just evidence that our graveyard was very intensively used over the period. And finally, we have a question, well, not finally, another question. Did you find the original church? No. There are probable original Anglo-Saxon church. Well, the very first one was wooden. We know that because Bede tells us that. But it's replaced by a stone one. It's possible that the wooden one was actually kind of kept as a shrine and then stood inside the stone church, because we know that when the monks left, they say how they actually dismantled one of the wooden churches and took them with them, almost like a relic. There is this stone church underneath the priory church, which is found in the early excavations. And I said there's fragments of the stone church in the parish church. There's also this church thing up on the Hjuff. One of the questions is, what do we mean by the original church? Because somewhere like Lindisfarne would have had multiple churches. If you visit Iona, it has multiple churches. There's a description of Lindisfarne which talks about something called the Green Church, which was specifically for women, and that's described how it's outside the main centre of the monastery. So that's another church out there, assuming that's not the one on the Hjuff. So potentially there's all sorts of churches. I think the oldest and earliest one is probably going to be underneath the later priory, because that's where Cuthbert's relics seem to have been, and he would have been put into the main church. What's interesting is with the one up on the Hjuff is there's no sign of a wooden predecessor. The people who dug it would have found it. They knew exactly what to look for. They dug it really, really well. And I have every confidence there'd been any sign of a smaller wooden church under that, they would have picked it up. So so it's probably there, but not get atable. We did do a ground penetrating radar survey of the interior of the priory church. That's like a kind of geophysical survey of the interior, and we didn't really find much, because I think a lot of the archaeology done there in previous years has kind of mashed it all up. So I don't hold much hope of finding anything there. And finally, what's the most significant find you found so far? I ought to say the gaming piece, because that's the one which is the most kind of beautiful, most impressive. Personally, I really like the whale bone and the seal bone and the kind of faunal remains, because I'm very interested in how the Anglo-Saxons related to their coast and how they related to the sea. So I like those, and I do like my little bit of sculpture with the parallels from Whithorn, because it reminds us of those Western links. So that brings us, unless there's any more questions, that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for everybody coming. We've had, I'm just trying to see how many people we've had. 100. I think we reached a peak of 115 earlier on. So that's absolutely wonderful. People are prepared to, not kind of, I don't know what's on TV tonight, but you're not watching it certainly, so neither do you. It's great to see you all here. As I said, there will be a whole series of future lectures coming up in the next couple of weeks. Also, we're going to start launching some of our projects which we plan to launch in person. We're going to try and getting those online. So our Holy Wells project is hopefully going to start, if I can just get some final bits recorded over the next couple of days. We'll try and launch that within the next week or days. Otherwise, this time next week, it will be Dr. Freya Horsfield, who I think is somewhere here, who will be talking about later medieval monasteries. She gets interested in them just as I start losing interest, because anything after the Normans is really not very exciting. So that's me showing my biases. Thank you very much. Look after yourselves. Look forward to seeing you all too with future projects. If you're not on our mailing list, do send me an email. I'm David Petts. You can find me by Googling very, very easily, and Durham University. So just send me an email and I can put you onto our mailing list, and I'll send around Zoom link for next week a couple of days beforehand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, David.
Cheers.
Thank you.